Hello there, Seraphim17 once again. This is my ReCore walkthrough. This is mission 24, Eden Tower, floor 3. So we're getting to the point now where the tower's going to be throwing everything it has at you, and some of these new tricks are pretty interesting. They're the kind of tricks that the game could have benefited from earlier. And I think there are a lot of ways you could have implemented this, which could have made it interesting, because I think the idea of the tower, which I touched upon earlier as we go across the moving squares, is it's this notion of the technology going bad, essentially. The tower is now against you because it's been reprogrammed. Instead of helping humans, it's now hindering them. So there could have been something along those lines all across the game, if you think about it. You could have had zones you went through, which were just designed normally like they are, like the dungeons, and then you could have had Victor popping up and triggering some kind of virus or some kind of reprogramming or some kind of just malicious software kicking in, anything you want to call it, any kind of story trope you need, and then it shifts towards this menacing looking red glowing, fearful zone where everything's trying to trick you and kill you, and the difficulty ramps up exponentially. They could have had it like a little bit like, is it the nightmare versions of the levels on Super Meat Boy? I know I keep going back to Super Meat Boy because it's a great game with a lot of great design in it, but just the idea of it, to add an element to a level that you've already conquered is something that can be interesting. And I think when I read some of the previews for the game and they were talking about some of the things that they were kind of concerned about, look at this right now. There are these things that are above me, I think, that you can destroy, and if you destroy them, it stops this area from being passively radiated. It will also stop radiating over time once you do this encounter, but I believe you can shoot the source of this. It might be on a different floor, I could be wrong, but I think you can. But this is another one of those mechanics that they don't really touch upon. Do you see the thing flying up there? I think it's them that's doing it. But this is essentially a fight with a bit of a time limit on it, or at least a degradation of your life. And earlier today I was talking about Soul Edge or Soul Blade, whichever the first Soul Calibur game was on PlayStation. And there were trials during Edgemaster mode where you were going to get weapons for the characters, which was a super fun part of it. It's probably the most fun I've had in a fighting game. They created an entire campaign around weird, goofy challenges, and they put a story to it, which just made it so cool back when, fighting games really used to try on all the options they offered. But during that, there were moments where you were poisoned. For whatever reason, you were poisoned and you had to defeat your opponent before you died. And it's a simple addition, but it's something that adds a different bit of flair to the missions, and this is kind of ReCore's equivalent of it. But I never felt like it happened enough for it to become anything that you could really talk about. Like, I can't call it a mechanic because it turns up once outside of a level, outside of the hub world when you go too far off map, and the game's like, if you continue on this path, we're going to kill you. Because it's easier than designing another way that tells you not to be here. So, kill you we will. And I found it really interesting that they would drop it on you here. And I'm going to keep paraphrasing this with, I haven't played the late game dungeon where you have all the cores, because I haven't gone back to this game after I recorded this walkthrough. I'm quite looking forward to doing so once they patch the load times, because it's really the worst problem the game has. As we complete another hunting challenge, which I'm not entirely too sure what the hunting challenges are about, because it's another one of the aspects of the game which I don't think is introduced in the best way, and it isn't emphasised in any real way either. So you've got these hunts, but they always feel as superficial as the equipment that you're picking up, because the equipment doesn't mean anything to you until you go back to the crawler, and that's when it starts to really resonate. When you pick it up, it might as well be nothing, because it doesn't mean anything until you see whether or not it's worth its weight in gold. Because let's face it, how many times have you been full of cores and full of equipment and you don't know what to get rid of because you don't really have any understanding of what is good in this game? And they do, mediate between things using the barriers, or the borders, sorry, of gold, silver and so on to give you an idea of rarity, but not necessarily quality. And I think it's a flaw of the game that it doesn't translate what is great. And I think it's only a flaw for the people who are going to mildly nibble around with this game and not really take a big bite. If you're someone who's going to play a lot of ReCore, then you're going to become very familiar with what the codes mean and what the loot means and everything, but if you have to go to that extent to learn that kind of information, I think that the game in some way has not done an adequate job of conveying it, and there's a fine line between such mechanics in my opinion. Because things like the original Dark Souls, which you'll notice I mention a lot, the thing I liked about that game is an experienced player knew things that new players didn't, and it affected gameplay in very, very, very important ways, from the poise breakpoints to how many stats you needed to wield weapons to how to accurately use weapons, durability figures. There was 101 things that if you knew about and your opponent didn't, that you would have some kind of advantage that made it really fun. Because knowledge paid off. And there is a line between that, having systems that are generally eclectic intentionally so that the impetus is on the person to learn them and then reap the rewards of it, whereas in this game, it doesn't really matter what things are called because you're never going to need to know that. All you're going to need to know is generally how you get them and what their stats are when you put them on your buddies, because that's the only thing they affect. So in as much as this game, I don't think it's as endearing as a feature as it would be like knowing your poise breakpoints, knowing how to parry online, knowing how to counter backstabs when latency is involved. All these techniques that if you have them, when you fight a human in Dark Souls, you have a good chance of surviving. Whereas if they don't know it, they're going to think you're cheating, teleporting, and send you some pretty hateful messages because they don't like dying in Dark Souls for some reason, which is awesome because then you can show them on YouTube and everybody gets a good laugh. But here is another one of the fights that's using this radiation as a bit of a gimmick, and this is me looking into the sky to see if I can get rid of it. I'm not too sure how it works, this mechanic, but it is interesting. You know, we've talked a lot about games and about design and about mechanics when it comes to this walkthrough, because it's all we've had to really speak about, because once I highlighted the strategies and some of the techniques, that's all you really needed to know, and you probably already knew them to begin with, so it's difficult for me to convey something that I think you need to know, because in essence, you don't. If you've played a third-person shooter competently, you will be able to learn this game and play very well, very quickly, because the game never... Like, did you see that then? I got headbutted from off-screen by a dude doing his attack. How many times has that happened in this walkthrough? Twice? Maybe? At most? Why? If they were a legitimate threat doing that quite a lot, you would have to prioritise them, and they would become the first thing you killed. But as it stands, the enemies just don't do enough. And I can understand why they don't want them to do too much, because, you know, if you've got all these things attacking you at once, it can get crazy. We've all played those games where you upped that difficulty and the aggression went through the roof and it turned into a completely different game. And in a game such as this, you don't have a block, so you can't just use a block. And the dodge is good for platforming, but I wouldn't say it's good for getting you out of a bad situation just because of the way the AI works. So I think that there's a hand of discipline there from the devs where they've realised that they couldn't have everybody attacking you all the time really crazily because it wouldn't have worked, because of just the way the game functions. And I've been playing Banjo-Kazooie recently, and that's a really interesting game in a lot of ways. That game came out, I think, in 98. That is an eternity in video games. Think of what phone you had in 98. Think of how you accessed the internet in 98, and think about now. Technology moves so fast, so the divides between periods are massive. So Banjo-Kazooie, for its time, had some great ideas, and it was probably the paramount of its league of competition with what it did. But you play it now, and a lot of things don't hold up as well, because we've mastered these mechanics, we've changed the techniques, and things don't work the same. So you come up against them in Banjo, and back in the day, you wouldn't have even noticed it or complained, because it was just how games worked. So you just went with it, and you're like, this is awesome. Now, I'm gritting my teeth, I'm shouting, I'm getting mad, I'm getting irritated. It's like, what the fuck? Were we drunk when we played these? But back then, it was quality, and it still is quality. You just have to appreciate that it shows the scars of the time it was made, and those scars were important to learn from them to get these mechanics that we have today. So playing this game has been incredibly educational to me, even though it's ruined a lot of my memories of Banjo in essence. It hasn't got rid of them completely, it's just tarnished them a little bit because I'm so used to being like, wow, Banjo's an amazing game, Banjo's this and that, it's got great platform, it's got great this, and then you go back and you're like, some of this is true. A lot of it's true indeed, and when you take it with that pinch of salt of, oh, it was made in 98, it gets rid of all the critique. But the things in it, you're just like, what the fuck? Like, to look at the aesthetic of Banjo, you'd think it was a children's game. A lot of people seem to think, because something looks quite childish, it's for children. Mario's for children, you know, that kind of stuff. When we know as gamers, there is some stuff in that kids can't do. Because it's a game that's meant to be enjoyed by anybody. It just has a demographic and a visual style that's meant to draw in children to get the parents to buy it for them, because that was the market for what games were aimed at the beginning. You know, games were aimed at kids. Because adults were too busy doing important things like growing fantastic mustaches and regretting their fashion senses 20 years later. Whereas children didn't do shit. They just dug with spades and, you know, showed each other the private parts and stuff. The shit you did before you had screens everywhere and glowing lights to distract you. So that's why it was always that way. Bandits and gambling was for adults, where games for kids. That's changed now. A lot has changed. Gaming's changed. And Banjo-Kazooie is a game that you could easily just write it off as being for children. But I could hand you the controller on a section, and you'd struggle to do it, even though you think of yourself as an adept gamer. And it's just how it works, because there's a lot of great design in it. And it's the same way with things like Pixar movies. Like, you know, Shrek's a decent example of this. A lot of people looked at Shrek as if it was a kid's movie, but then you watched it, and there was all that subtle humour, and the double entendres, and the adult humour in there that the kids don't see because they're too busy looking at the donkey and laughing at the big ogre and things. But it's that beautiful balance of incorporating two demographics and two audiences and entertaining both of them at the same time. And it's a very fine balance, and it's the sign of a true artist, in my opinion, if you can do that. And Banjo has that in spades in a lot of areas of it, because there are some pretty tricky stuff, but for the most, you wouldn't ever look at it as being a really difficult thing. But I noticed so many aspects of the design which, if it happened today, we would call bullshit and call it bad. And a great one is the enemies. The enemies, for the most, are passive. They're quite a passive enemy. When you get close enough to them, they'll see you, and they'll come and attack you. But in that game, you have a bunch of attacks, like so many attacks that you don't even need. Just do the jumping Kazooie Peck, which has got wicked active frames and kills anything, really. But you have all these attacks that you can deal with them, and they usually go down in one hit. So you kill them, you get your honeycomb back, you're like, that's cool, it's simple, it's easy, it's fun. It's a system that works, let's not think about this too hard. But what happens when you don't kill them is really interesting. So, for instance, if you were going to try and skip an enemy, or you just didn't want to fight them, or you had full life and you just wanted to avoid them, let's say you don't jump correctly and you miss your jump, and they attack you. They'll put you into a stun animation where you bounce backwards and Banjo does the kind of thing when he gets hit, and you'll lose a bit of life. And they're programmed to continue to assail you, so you can have these really interesting moments where you'll try and attack them, and you'll do this bounce-off animation, because they have some kind of like bounce-off magnetic field thing that happens every so often. And as you're recovering from the bounce-back animation, they'll be running towards you, and they will keep their hurt box, so where they deal damage, on your character. So when you come out of the invincibility of your stunned animation, the second you go active, they damage you again. So if you've got no life, they can essentially loop you and kill you. And this is in a game that's just a platformer that's nice and easy. And there are wonderful moments where you'll take damage off of environmental water, and then when you get back on land, an enemy will hit you. Like another good example is the snowmen. The snowmen from Freeze Easy Peak. All they do is throw snowballs at you and laugh at you. That's all they do. But their snowballs will be thrown where you are headed and where you will be, not where you are. So they do these miracle, majestic, like Roberto Carlos free kick throws that just hit you. And you're like, what the fuck? And they're really good at it because the AI still has that arcade jankiness of it, of where AI was perfect and an absolute asshole to steal money from people in arcades. And it has these moments of great design and really progressive, innovative design, and then there are just these moments of you fall on a pretty tricky section and you die. And then when you die and lose all your lives, it shows you a cutscene that kicks you to the beginning of the hub area, so you have to run all the way through it to get back to where you were. And these wonderfully archaic moments of, wow, we got punished back then, and nowadays it just doesn't exist. So it's so interesting to look back and to see how it's shaped moving forward, and I love that intricate balance between old ethoses and new ones, because it really is fascinating to me. But there's another flaw in the tower. Couple more coming up, guys. You can do this. You're at the end now. You got through the bullshit. Thank you for watching. You take care.